Can you hear me? Yep. Thanks, Durwin. Thanks for the introduction. Thanks for this opportunity. So I used some of the materials a few years ago when we were looking at that journey. As I understand, we are talking about our journey into the whole FHIR ecosystem, going through the evaluation of FHIR, FHIR server, and then the journey of how we went about implementing it. I thought about, at here, everyone knows interoperability. You guys are defining many of the standards. But anyways, this is more about saying without FHIR, the way the ecosystem, current healthcare industry ecosystem would work is we already have interoperability standards like EDI and HL7, which help integrating from a provider systems to payer systems and all that. So these standards make it possible to do integrations in a compliant way. But these standards also require, the way the implementations today are, robust EDI systems that understand the data, parse that data and all. As shown here, you would have systems understanding this data and then making this data available to a member. Generally would be through a portal that is available through this vendors or this solutions. A payer might build a portal, or the providers, I think the previous presenter said, you build it, they will come. So yeah, I mean, that was the concept. They would have all of those, EDI systems, and then they would build a portal. Adoption, innovation, not that much that you would see. I mean, of course, at the big ecosystem players are doing a lot in this space. But where FHIR is helping move, or why FHIR for interoperability is, in general, I think, as Dr. Jeffy was showing the timeline in the industry of, moving into the FHIR ecosystem, I would say healthcare is a bit behind, right? The consumerization of IT happened first. Employees started saying, why can't I use my device? That's how many of the BYOD and all those technologies started. Like, people are accustomed to using technology at home. People are able to accustomed to getting their data on their devices, like the finance and also mobile apps. So the innovation in the other industries has been happening. Data and getting the data unlocked, available to not only in our case, payers or provider systems in the healthcare industry, but equivalent in that in the finance industry, it was like banks only having the data. But with unlocking that is where you saw innovation, is where the Mint mobile apps and other things came into the being. So similarly, in the healthcare ecosystem is why the whole purpose of interoperability was so that there'll be more innovation. If you unlock, if you make it easy to integrate, if you make it easy for anyone to understand our industry, healthcare industry's specs, and if you make it easy, then you might see some innovation. There might be someone who can come up with a mobile app, and that's what you're seeing a lot. Different type of mobile apps, different type of devices, and we're unlocking that data. When you're unlocking the data, we are making it simple. There is more adoption in the industry. So FHIR helps with that. When the payers, the providers, the EHRs, everyone is adopting to FHIR standards, then they are, that standard is helping with, the interoperability case. And that is allowing others who are not in this space, like the third-party mobile app developers, also to get into this system, understand how to use this data, and make some data available in however they can imagine for their app. As you see, there are many different types of apps now in the industry, and many different fitness and tracking devices, and how people are able to innovate and like the Apple ecosystem and all that. People are now looking into and seeing how we can make more apps. Again, FHIR and the interop standards are the ones helping, and the purpose of them was to help with that innovation. So that's something that I was trying to go through, explain that. I don't want to go too technical, but again, just to explain in case, again, why FHIR or what is FHIR? Even before FHIR, or just a parallel in the industry, as again, going through the timeline, as systems were getting modernized, any big application, we are breaking monolith applications into microservices. That's what you see in the back end. We are enabling, a lot of the integrations through APIs. APIs were the ones that were helping, adoption of a lot of these, mobile apps and all, because, that's simpler to understand, simpler to integrate. So APIs, RESTful architecture, these are the things that were unlocking, making integration easy in the industry in general. REST is basically a design specification that allows you to, exchange data over HTTPS, just to make it clear. So those standards are well defined, in the web technologies. Those are the ones that FHIR is, built based on. So FHIR is a RESTful implementation, an API, and because of those things, it was easy for, to get more adoption, to get more people learning about it. Now, so the learning curve is less steep than the other technologies. Part of any API specification, again, the reason why this is helpful for anyone looking into, defining a FHIR or why FHIR. If you're defining your own APIs, which was where we started our journey, we were defining APIs, we were exposing APIs for our partner consumption. Any API definition would require you to understand your data model and, create a resource for that data model, and then, write documentation for that resource so that it can be exposed over HTTPS. That is a typical, implementation for any API development. What FHIR gives you is all this for free. So that's why, your data model is already defined, your resources are defined. That's what FHIR gives you. And then following RESTful specs, so your operational models are defined, your CRUD operations, get, put, and all those. So that is why FHIR is easy to learn, easy to adopt. So, a high school graduate coming out could say, what, if I want to learn this specs, I do understand APIs, I do understand REST. Let me understand what is FHIR APIs, FHIR resources, and that should be easier for them to learn. And that would allow for, again, the innovation and all that. So again, what you get through FHIR is all that work is done for us. A lot of the data model and all that is given. So that's why, that's a good standard to, to move quickly. Again, it is lightweight, also another one that I missed. Because of the way it is defined, because of the way the APIs generally work for a mobile app and other integration types, you don't want to have a whole huge lot of data. It's like whatever is key. So the resources are defined in the FHIR model to be lightweight exactly for the purpose for that particular, interaction. So that's why FHIR, and that's what FHIR helps solve, why that standard is, helping with that part of the innovation. I was just trying to make sure, why it was important. It was a good sell to say either we define our own APIs or use FHIR, that's better. So then, what does a FHIR server do, and what does a FHIR server give us? I use a typical high-level implementation of the FHIR server. At a high level, and again, this might help answer some of the. It has two parts. The FHIR server, RESTful server part of that. Again, since it is a RESTful server, there's a RESTful server engine that is key functions are around the CRUD operations that I've mentioned about REST CRUD operations. And then it helps some of the parsing, serialization of the data and stuff, implementation, following the implementation guides, the profiles and stuff, so validation and stuff like that. Those are the key pieces that, high level, you want to make sure you can implement. Either you build your own or you want something that does it for you. So that's one of the key parts of a FHIR server implementation. And the second part, which is persistence framework, which is, again, the second part of, as I mentioned, there is a data model involved. So generally, where do you store this data? And when you want to store the data, right, what schemas and you'll define, what will be the structure and all. Again, FHIR solves it. If you already follow that model, then, store it in that model format and you're FHIR compliant. You don't need to design your data model also. But so, this is typically any FHIR server, persistent framework, and the facade or the implementation side of the rules and all. Those are two things that generally makes up the FHIR server. again, I was breaking this to get to the next one, which is what are the implementation options when you go with a FHIR server? So do you need a FHIR server was one thing of, some of the capabilities I showed. And then if you're doing a FHIR server, what are the options? At least the ones that we were considering when we were looking at it a few years ago. There are two options, a full FHIR server with the repository. Now this is where you follow all the specs as well as you store the FHIR data with the following the model into the FHIR repository. So there are products, there are vendors who are, all have solved for, what that model is and what their repository will be. Some, depending on the vendors, some allow any data source, some have their own. So anyways, so with the repository model, you are all in, you're storing your data in the model format, you get everything back in the model that is stored in. And the second one is a facade model, where if you already have a data source and you have been having all this data in your proprietary format and you don't want to go change that, you don't want to store the data, or you don't want to go through, moving all the data to the FHIR format, then you leverage your existing data sources, and it's only where you have to comply or you have to expose or get data, then you just do it at the facade layer level, where you just map to your format to the FHIR format as you are, going back and in and out of your company. So that would be the facade model, which is not storing the data in that model, just mapping it and validating and all the other capabilities, or the full. So those are the two main generally that we also considered, and those are the two consideration points as you are in your FHIR journey of which one are you in. Do you have a lot of data already there? We at CSC, as I mentioned, we have been having our APIs exposed again for our own mobile app. So we were in that journey before others of exposing APIs. We created our own data model for exposing this data. We also had APIs with our B2B partners. As I'm showing this diagram, we have some APIs that we were already sharing with our partners as APIs. So we already had some of the data. We didn't want to go all in for some of the time things. So anyways, let me advance to the second one. So this is our implementation again. So what I'm saying is we already, just to give following from right to left, and the color coding, yellow is existing unmodified. We didn't have to do any changes. The brownish is what we had. They were existing components we had to modify, and green is all new. So looking at our house, we looked at and said, well, I already have a lot of the data that I'm doing for claims, or we don't have patient API, we have member APIs and all. So I would just use a facade for everything that I already have. It works for many other systems, so we'll do facade model. So, but we also have a full and repository model also, because for anything, so we have a hybrid. We are doing both facade as well as full. So anything that we already had, we are a facade model. For some data that we never had an API, we did not create one. It was not a need then yet, but it is a new one. And as I mentioned, the benefits of going with FHIR was, well, I don't have to design that model. I don't have to design that API. Well, then why don't I just get it? It's a good, get it for free. So then for those where we never had an API or we were planning to build a new one, we went with the full repository model. So again, this is just an example. They are not the real names, but so facade. So it's a use case based design. We are using both implementations. All of those FHIR server components is what we added. We already had an API gateway, as I mentioned, to expose our APIs. So our FHIR server is behind our gateway. And for our APIs, we had an internal developer portal. So it's all our developers who are developing APIs were able to access what APIs are there, or what the documentation is, what does it do, and all that. So for FHIR, we had to look into a external facing developer portal, because how do you communicate your API specifications to now external developers, again, to enable innovation, to enable and to support the CMS interoperability rules and all. So these were how we implemented it. Okay. A bit more on the portal then. Our journey as we once implemented the FHIR server, some of the rules were, okay, now you have to make it available. How do you enable the people to see? So again, on a dashboard dial, it's going from left to right here. We already had our internal, as I was mentioning, our developers were able to do the look at the documentation of the API, how to use them, how to test them. Our mobile app was working with it. As we also had partner-facing APIs. A benefit or given with partner-facing was we had our agreements with them, so we were able to exchange what is the SLAs, what are the NFRs for my API, and then what is the contract, right? How much can you call me, and what does my documentation look like? So all that was there. When you're getting into this space with third parties, these are unknown entities. There is no contract. We cannot negotiate on things. So how do we ensure that when they are going to start using my APIs, I can still build some, how much will you use me and how much will I allow you to use my APIs and all that, as well as how do I let you access to my APIs? Which APIs will I allow you to use? Which APIs, how do you register and all that? So that is what we also built as part of the FHIR implementations. It's not only the server; it's also how do you make it available. As part of that, there are some new policies, new compliance checks we had to introduce, all that. So that was a big effort also that we had to go through at HCSC. Yeah, that's what I think. So then, basically from, again, as what we are sharing here is our journey as a payer, and as we started this a few years ago, and how did we go about selecting a server, and so things we started with the RFP process, our standard go evaluate a few vendors. While looking at that, again, I'm talking about 2019, so few years ago. But at that time also there were many players. There are different deployment options as you look at them. Some are on-prem that you install in your infrastructure. Some are in the cloud, so you can completely get it hosted in the cloud. Some allow you to lock your data, so it is still in the cloud, but your data. Some are wanting the data. So it is many different deployment options. You would have to consider, what is beneficial for your use case. How would you implement? And, again, what are your rules around, data and all that. So many deployment options. We ended up with something that, of course, can be hosted by us in our cloud as well as on our infrastructure. What you would need to consider as what we had to do is, well, we already have an API gateway. We already have APIs. Why do we need to build FHIR APIs? That is a question. Yeah, FHIR is also an API. If you follow that documentation from the FHIR guides and implement it, yeah, if there is only one API you want to expose. But I mean, typically, if you're into the FHIR, and you're developing and exposing or providing a lot of FHIR services, a FHIR server will help. Again, the capabilities that I mentioned that you want to do out of the box. API gateways would not be helping with those validations that the FHIR server would do, like the compliance of the profiles and all that. So that is what you'll not get. But again, API gateway, and do you want the FHIR server to be in parallel behind all the things you'll have to consider. Your identity gateway, how do you want to use your identity with FHIR? Security, so we did look at all the smart on FHIR specs, like our existing OAuth. We already were using OAuth. FHIR is mandating using OAuth and other OIDC specs. So leveraging some of the FHIR specs like smart on FHIR, which again a FHIR server helps implement it quicker. faster. But there will be considerations. Data model, as I mentioned, do you want to define your own? Do you want to leverage? Does it work for you? So that would be consideration. Storage was another one, with the FHIR repository. If you're thinking about repository, there are rules in some of the mandates of how long you have to maintain the data. At HCSC, we had to consider, as we were looking at all the different providers facing FHIR specs and all, how many years we have to maintain the data. So storage is an important consideration. Legal and compliance policies, this is internally more than the FHIR, enabling the FHIR for external consumption. We had to go through a lot of discussions with our legal and compliance of, how do you, what are the rules and regulations of, approving an app to use your APIs, the FHIR APIs, and how do you educate the member? In our case for FHIR, how do we educate the member that, this data is now, being given to a third party, what's the payer's responsibility, the member's responsibility. So a lot of legal and compliance policies will have to be relooked at, again, depending on which area you are payer, provider and all. What are your rules? And, exposing APIs today versus exposing APIs with the FHIR specs, is there anything changes? And then for us, FHIR readiness testing versus production, we were able to quickly get to test, depending on, as I mentioned, cloud-based deployments are easier to, quickly you can get a FHIR server in your test environment up and ready. We took a time to get to prod because of a lot of these other, compliance policies and other discussions. I think that's about it. Hope it was helpful from our journey. Questions?
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Two quick questions. One is, you mentioned cloud-based environment. Did you use, which cloud environment did you use? And, did you use their health platform? Did they already have a FHIR server? Like Google has one. I don't know about AWS, but if you could answer that, please. And then the data model you mentioned, if you don't have a structured data model, you could still use FHIR. Is that where you're talking about transformation on the fly? If you could elaborate on that, please. Thank you.
So the first one, I don't know if I can give any product vendor's name here, at least from my. So what I was telling you is, as you're looking at the evaluation, there are many different types of products, right? So I've seen servers from vendors where you can take their software and deploy it to your servers in your data center, or that same software could also run into a cloud, any cloud vendor. So there are many who are cloud agnostic. You can go to AWS, Azure. That software can run on any cloud. That's one type of vendors I've seen. There are cloud vendors who are also FHIR server implementers. Again, so that's a good spectrum. They are in the data space and looking at FHIR. They are in the cloud space and looking at FHIR, versus they are FHIR vendors and saying I can deploy anywhere. It's a broad spectrum of vendors who are in the space of FHIR. So if that helps answer, not the broad. So again, so let me talk about the software vendors who say they can deploy to any cloud, right? So there are vendors, you can take their software, deploy it to your AIX server on-prem, right? That same software, they say they can run it on any of the clouds. So, as far as you have a HIPAA compliant cloud, you can install it on any of the clouds. So there are those type of vendors. And then there are others who, are only in the cloud. So that's the kind of considerations you'll have to do. The second part of your question, the second question was, if you have so again, your question was around, the data and repository. So if you already have your data in your own repositories, and you have a well-defined architecture of, how all your systems today are working with it, right? And you don't want to go away from that and use that, and then just FHIR is one additional implementation. The facade model allows you to do that, where, let's say you We validated that you only have to, again, I don't know which industry you're from, but there are only few patient access APIs that you wanted to expose, right? So then a facade model, you can say, I'll use my data model, same sources. The facade is where you'll do the mapping. You'll convert from your data model format, your API, map it to FHIR. When the going out, data coming in, when a query is coming in, it will be a FHIR query, right? The FHIR server will then map it to your API model. Okay, that query calls your API. And in some cases, you might have two APIs you might internally have implemented. So then it's the facade model where you're not storing in their model, you're just orchestrating the API calls. So that's the facade model.
Did you use sorry, this is from the chat. Did you use a FHIR repository with any legacy systems? And if so, why did you do that instead of using a FHIR facade?
We, as I mentioned, so for us at HCSC, it's a use case based. We have both type of implementations. So for, I won't say legacy, for existing APIs, like, if I am exposing to my mobile apps, they are APIs, or my partners are calling my APIs. So for the use cases where we had an API or we had the data easily, converted to RESTful implementations, we use the facade model. And we use the repository model where we had not yet defined the APIs or the data model. So it was not legacy versus new implementation. They were all in the RESTful microservices architecture. It was whether we already have it, or are we starting that journey, and why not build it with FHIR then if you're building new.
You there? My hardball question. So you mentioned you got mixed, right? So you've got FHIR repo, right? And then you've got a facade. Do you have a situation? He's pointing to me. You're number one. So can you give us some lessons learned in that mixed model on what things that you were challenged you're faced with you had to overcome? So for instance, right? Did you have a situation where you had parts of the patient longitudinal record spanning both repository and facade persistent store that you basically had dynamically joined? Does that make sense? I'm looking for what kind of challenges on that kind of mixed model.
Probably those are something coming up for us, I guess. But yeah, so I would say I can check on the team. Right now, as I mentioned, the new ones, which was more around observations and all, we've not got a mixed case yet. Our patient data or member data, it's our own member, ODS repositories, and not yet come into a scenario where I cannot solve, or, I have come up with the conflict of those two. But yeah, I mean, we might be learning as more and more comes. So if it comes up, definitely we'll discuss.
Another question from the chat. Do you support a direction of regulators permitting FHIR-to-FHIR exchange between covered entities, even for standard transactions?
What, like standard, can you repeat that? Probably I'll need to make sure. Or Durwin, if you have understood what the context was, just so.
I can just read what he
Sure.
texted in, but do you support a direction of regulators permitting FHIR-to-FHIR exchange between covered entities, even for standard transactions?
Yeah, so I mean, some of those are like, I mean, in general, yes, FHIR is simplifying many of the integrations. So yes, if there is an existing integration standard, but not in FHIR, then yes, we do support that if the resources are ready. I think that is simplifying integrations. But and I don't know if prior auth and other fall into this category of, because I mean, that's what. So yeah, we do support in principle. Yeah. Does it help? Okay.
Hey, Arpit, quick question right here.
Hey.
I find that
many health plans that have their own FHIR servers on-prem do it because it's strategic. You feel that's something you're going to build on in the future, right? So the question is, naturally some interoperability from CMS, and now you have prior auth that's coming up on a proposed rule. Naturally, those are going to fall within your FHIR servers. There's so many other use cases from accelerator projects that are out there that seem to have a lot of promise, right? So I won't name them all, but just curious if have you begun to implement some of those other use cases that haven't been mandated?
So I think we already have, the CMS interoperability, we are doing the Da Vinci use cases and others. So here you can have this.
Yeah, we've implemented for the patient access stuff, information and stuff, and we're working on the development for the prior auth things and stuff like that. So those are in development, they're in works. But yeah, we do see future that this is the way that the industry is going to go. Yeah,
Like the provider-facing ones, we are doing the payer provider API. We are looking at some of those, coming to the Da Vinci and others. So,
just the ones that are
just any tips or challenges as far as security and compliance is concerned that you may have experienced in your journey?
yeah, so challenges on the legal and security and compliance were the portal one, the external facing, at least from a payer perspective. And that was a big change in the shift of, it was easy for us to say we're exposing APIs, or we do that. We've been doing that for a long time with our partners, as I mentioned, but with partners, there is an agreement, right? So, with moving over to, the portal side, the third party side, it was like, okay, how do I, what is my common, thing, or, what is my agreement in this case, or am I not bound? So those were one for us, that was big. Security side, again, having APIs already, as I mentioned, we were doing OIDC, OAuth specs already, so that was not new for us. But with FHIR, and the number of resources that are there with FHIR, we looked at, can we do the same that we were doing? Looking at Smart on FHIR and other specs, it made it simple to follow, those standards. And so I think that would be another tip for you. That is what our journey was. They've already solved how you can, provide access to that FHIR resources, right? Patient star read, whatever. So we leverage those to say, that's easy to adopt FHIR. So why design our own, for security? So again, same OIDC, OAuth specs, and then the access rules is where we looked at, the Smart on FHIR and what it solved. So that was a tip from us, we liked it rather than, again, design. So I think that's where FHIR is why design your own when you can leverage some things.